Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast, sponsored by Downtown Dogs, the Twin Cities' largest doggy daycare and boarding facility. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TCG Folk. This week I talk with Sam Graber, an award-winning playwright and producer of the excellent podcast American Refugee. We talk about where the idea for the show came from, where his travels have taken him, and how his Jewish values come out in the podcast. In this week's Who the Folk podcast. Sam Graber, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Lonnie. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's funny. I just mentioned to you before we started recording, I've been hearing your voice all morning because I've started listening to your podcast, American Refugee, which is a really fun listen, by the way. But I guess for starters, tell people a little bit more about American Refugee and what was it that sparked you into creating this series?
So American Refugee is a nonpartisan journalistic podcast. It's distributed by OD Action. That's the network. And OD Action brings a daily base of over 250,000 email subscribers. And there's an extended social following of about 8 million. And the whole purpose of American Refugee is to carry an apolitical editorial mission and serve the full public interest. So I say that right up front because sometimes people hear American Refugee and they think liberal and they think, oh, this is, just a democratic mission, and it's politically motivated. And while that is partly some of the impetus behind the origination of the origin story of the podcast itself, I'm here to tell stories for all people wherever you are. And so we try to feature stories of people who have come into America from other countries. We're featuring stories about people who have moved out of America and even people who have moved within the country from one part of America to another. And what I try to tell folks is that, we're looking at the big stories hidden in the public eye of everyday life, taking people straight to, the border of the most pressing human rights challenges of our time, from resettlement and inequality and especially displacement. So the podcast really is a look at refugeeism in the broad term of refugeeism. It's not just the poor, tired, huddled masses that are sort of emigrating into the country. We have a lot of heartwarming, heartbreaking, and sometimes hilarious stories of American refugees.
So episode 1, for I'd say like 98% of it, right up until the end, and I'm not going to spoil the end for anybody, but you'd have to say it falls into the category of hilarious. Your trip to Los Algodones, did I pronounce that right?
That was very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Los Algodones, where you became a medical tourist, I think was the phrase that is you used and is sort of commonly used. Is that right?
Yes.
So was this the idea that sort of launched the podcast, or had you had this sort of topic in your mind before you got rolling with it?
Okay, so I'm going to tell a long story, but it's going to have a big payoff at the end because It's difficult to talk about, the first episode being about me going, I actually walked across the border into Mexico to get dental work done on my own teeth. It's hard to tell that without understanding where the podcast came from and how it started. So I had been for many years a creative professional like yourself, working here out of Minneapolis. And it was last July when I was visiting a very close friend in Northern California in a town called Gilroy. Well, Gilroy is a bedroom community. It's an exurb of Cupertino. So my buddy works at Apple headquarters. So I had just left something called the Garlic Festival, right? So my buddy for years had been like, hey, Sam, you must come to Gilroy, California. We have something called the Garlic Festival. It's this big outdoor festival. We get up to 50,000 people a year. And I'm like, bro, it's called the Minnesota State Fair. Okay, if you really want to come to an annual outdoor festival with a lot of people, you come my way. So finally I go out. We have a great time all weekend. I leave. There's hugs, there's goodbyes. And right as I leave is when the mass shooting happened. So for those of you out there who remember, oh yeah, there was the Gilroy, California Garlic Festival shooting. I had just walked out when the mass shooting started. My buddy and his 2 teenage sons had to dive into freezer trucks to avoid getting hit. So at that time, I had been looking for a shift in creative output for a variety of reasons. I won't bore you for that part of the story. But I had a friend who had been an early employee at Occupy Democrats, and he has a massive email list and essentially a big voter mobilization system. So I contacted him and I said, "Look, I know you want to get into podcasting, and I'm ready to start producing the podcast." And their podcast was called Democratica, and it was charting very high early on when they launched. And I said, "Look, in exchange for me producing Democratica, I'm going to create a podcast called American Refugee. And when American Refugee launches, I want you to market it through your network. This takes a huge burden off of the shoulders of the podcaster who's starting out going, well, I have this great content, I have this great concept, but I don't want to have to do all this work for, marketing distribution, essentially for making America aware of the podcast and getting everyone to listen. Because as I'm sure you know, and as all your listeners probably know, anybody with a microphone now can just start a podcast and launch, and there's a million podcasts right now on Apple. So how do you cut through? Well, they were essentially giving me the platform to cut through. So by the time I was ready to launch American Refugee, there was a friend in town who had heard about my proof of concept, which was about the dental refugees, the Americans going across the border into Mexico. Okay. So I said, yeah, I'm just going to talk to some experts and it'll be interesting. And he's like, who cares about that? I'm like, well, it'll be interesting. He's like, Sam, why would anyone care unless you actually go there? Like, yeah, but that's going to change the whole concept of the podcast. And it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of travel. And he's like, yeah, that's what makes it interesting. So that I basically had to, I had in the can the first episode. I took it out of the can and went, okay, back to the proverbial audio drawing board and said, we're going to have to go to Los Algodones, Mexico. So I called the network head, my friend who runs OD Action, and my friend said, let's go to Mexico. So he and I went, and it was intentionally hilarious. This is a long answer to your question, Lonnie. I'm so sorry.
No. That's okay.
But
it gets interesting how the journey of how you got here.
Yeah. So the journey story of the origin is it was intentionally hilarious because, one, I think I'm funny. I enjoy being funny. Like, I'm a great time at parties, but I know that with the term American Refugee and just by the description alone, people are going to go, oh, why would I want to listen for 30 to 45 minutes about, hardships and inequity and difficulty? Like, I'm getting in my car. Remember, this is before coronavirus. I'm getting in my car and I'm driving an average of 22 minutes one-way commute to work. Why do I want to listen to something that's going to make me sad? And I was like, I need to do something that's fun and upbeat for the first episode so that people will want to come back. So we went to Mexico. You have to listen to the episode because it's an absolute blast. We had a great time, learned a lot, very interesting, very eye-opening, not just mouth-opening, ha, zing, but very eye-opening, very ear-opening. And that got me launched. I mean, that started the whole concept of I'm actually traveling. I'm actually going to the places. And so that's the origin story of American Refugee and why the first episode is about walking across the border into Mexico.
And it really was quite hilarious and totally unexpected. And I think that's really what I think people are going to find interesting. And it's certainly what I did was that you see the title of it and you listen and it's immediately not what you think it's going to be.
Right. I mean, and that's sort of the basis for the entirety of the podcast series itself, which is I want it to always have, I guess, within the cloud of seriousness or within the cloud of I mean, it is serious content, right? Some of the other episodes, not Los Algodones, but we start getting into things like, the ICE detention system, and we start getting into the homeless, and we start getting into, people who have basically been stripped of their human rights, right? So, if the core of the podcast is human rights advocacy, I can't have it be I can't have the whole thing be serious. So I try to bring moments of levity and moments of brightness and lightness to what otherwise might be um, a serious cast, right? And that just comes from my skills as a storyteller and as a writer. I take a lot of time to craft these episodes so that people, that you come in and you don't want to leave until the episode's over. You and I'm sure, like a lot of people, have all of those moments when when we've been driving in our car and we hear something on the radio and we're like, I have to sit in the driveway. I can't get out until this is over. I have to finish listening. And so I've always tried to bring that grab and never let people go to American Refugee.
Oh no, that happens all the time. There are plenty of times where my kids will, leave me sitting in the car. I'll switch off the engine, but I'll listen to whatever I'm listening to until it ends, or until I hear what I need to hear, and then can go inside. So that absolutely happens.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with not just topicality, but geography, right? Like so many times we can feel as though the character, or a character that's infused within the story, comes from the setting itself. And so American Refugee is just like your podcast. It's a made in Minnesota podcast, but people from all over the country, if not all over the world, can hear it. And when they get a sense of locality or provinciality, it sort of unlocks the universality, right? Like from the local becomes the universal, or from the specific becomes the everything. And when that happens, it brings people all together to a particular place. So I feel that really, really helps the podcast, because since it is made in Minnesota, and since so much of the podcast is about Minnesota, mainly because, COVID came in March and it stopped all my travel plans. We really have brought a national listening audience into Minnesota.
So do you come to this from a creative background or a journalistic background? What led you into this field?
Yeah, so I definitely have a creative background. I don't have a journalistic background, although that, the journalist, wherever the latent journalistic gene, wherever it was buried in my body, got brought out by launching the podcast. No, my background is in the creative arts. I've been a writer and a producer for many, many years. I've really been huddled around the theater of football for a long time. And, what theater teaches you to do is to really take a story out back and beat it up and beat it up and beat it up. Because on stage, a minute can last an eternity. Like you can really lose an audience quickly if the story isn't hustling along, mm-hmm. or if the conflict and the tension on stage isn't there. You really can lose an audience. And so I brought, how many decades of production and presentation experience to the podcast, which is like, hey, I'm going to treat this in sort of the classic dramatic structure. And I want to tell people a story. It's like sitting around the campfire, but the difference is you can't see me. All you can do is hear me. However, in addition to just me, I'm bringing other voices in to the story that you're about to hear. So I try to treat it like, theater, but theater of the mind, and the story that can't stop. The story just really has to move you forward versus boring you. Because I'm sure there's been times you've been to the theater, or you've sat watching a screen, or even listening to podcasts where you're at like minute 50 going, okay, when is this thing going to end? Right. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And, I think that's the, podcasting I found is sort of the natural extension of sort of this goes back to the early days of radio with the story, when there were plays on radio.
Yes.
Basically,
yes.
This is sort of the natural extension that combines both, the journalistic side of, interviewing and telling stories through print.
Yes.
I'm old enough that I told stories through print, but later on, and now online.
Yes.
It sort of combines all of those things, but just in a modern medium.
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm a huge fan of OTR, of old time radio, and the golden age of radio. When you go back and you listen to some of the stories being told, I mean, Orson Welles's War of the Worlds wasn't a one-off. That they were part of a theater company that realized, hey, we need to move this on air. We need to get this to radio. They were creating these episodes on a weekly basis, and everything was live. Everything was live. Like even the orchestra was live. I mean, they have to write, rehearse, and create things on a hard, tight production deadline. I mean, you want to talk about deadline artistry. Like I don't have that burden over me. I just try to put out episodes once a month, and I have the benefit of going, oh, I didn't like that take, or let's edit this tighter. But to be a true deadline artist where you are so exposed, I mean, it's really wonderful to go back and listen to the 1940s, 1950s radio and go, these people were masters.
Absolutely. It's just a different level of the art form.
Yeah.
That, we're trying to work in now.
Yeah. But, of course, at the same time, we've moved it, just like everything else in the world. Like we just try to stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us and see a little bit farther and move it a little bit, better, for lack of a better word. And I think we've done that. There's some incredible stuff that's happening now. And you invoked the word journalism, and I didn't think I was going to get into a journalist's role or a journalistic capacity with the podcast, but I have. There's been some true episodes where I've done, the work of shining the harsh spotlight of exposure onto stories that wouldn't otherwise have been told. There are a lot of people in the country who don't have a voice. And all of a sudden I found myself in this role. I went from, the first episode, which was fun, and the second episode, which is about the homeless in Minneapolis. I'm like, oh, this is like, whoa. And, and it kept going.
Yeah,
and going.
That is a sharp departure from episode 1.
Right. And there's episodes about truck drivers, and I've got episodes, and and after George Floyd's murder, we were down in Minneapolis recording and talking to people on the streets, and there for part of the riots. It's like I didn't expect to be in a journalist role, and as you embrace it, you realize, well, look, old time radio, just to kind of finish the thought or close the thought loop here, that was entertaining. And this is entertaining, but it's entertaining with a much bigger purpose. I mean, this is true social justice. And if you can say, yeah, I like entertaining people, but I like entertaining people knowing that at the end of the listen or at the end of the day, we might actually change someone's life for the better. Why would you want to do anything else as a creative artist?
So had you connected yourself in any sort of social justice type activities prior to this, or had you come to it as you started the production side of the podcast?
Okay, so that is a great question, right? Because when I said, oh yeah, I'm going to get into podcasting, right? Podcasting. Let's see, you need a microphone, and you need, all right. So then you start getting into it and you realize, okay, so much about podcasting is about audio engineering. And yeah, I've been a professional musician for many years. Sorry, that was part of my origin story as well. I'll just slide that in there. So I'll slide in my professional musicianship there. But, I'd spent a lot of time in a recording studio, but I was always the talent. I was never the person at the board. I was like, oh, I have to learn audio engineering, and now I have to learn gear, right? And that took like a month, 2 months in the woodshed, just by myself. Like, okay, I have to learn all this software, because it is a highly software driven environment. If you're going to produce, A+ top quality audio material, right? It's about audio engineering.
Yeah.
So, and then I'm like, okay, refugeeism and immigration. Okay. Like I had never done anything in that space before. And while the people are the professionals, the true professionals who work in immigration advocacy and refugee and resettlement support, are very welcoming. I'm like, yeah, they have a whole lifetime of experience of work in this field. I mean, it's an industry for them. They take it very seriously. I can't just be, some guy like, hey, I want to do a podcast, right? So it took a lot of work to get into the particular field. And so there's like technical hurdles. There's subject matter hurdles. And then there's also like managing podcasts and audience development, understanding like how to distribute the story hurdles as well. It took a lot of work, right? So contrary to a lot of podcasts out there, the million of them, right? That I would say 75% of them are simply like hit play and hit record and hey, here's what I think today, right? Which is, if you go back to the start of podcasting, there was a lot of podcasts in 2005. It's like, hey, me and my friend are just hanging out in my kitchen this morning, listen to us talk. Like this is like a lot of barriers to entry for me, but I didn't stop, just because of, the immigration and the refugeeism as a Jew spoke to me very heavily. I don't know how many people out there listening have ever thought about Judaism and immigration or Judaism and refugeeism, but once the current White House administration took hold of the office, I started to think, how soon until Jews of the world are no longer in the safe and inviolate in many ways place that they are today. It was actually about 10 years ago, I was at an event in Temple, Israel. Temple, Israel, a downtown Reform congregation. So I was at...
nice plug. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was at Temple, Israel, and they were having an event, and it was a Rosh Hashanah event. So after the main sanctuary service, everybody gathered for, it was like, a speaker series. And the speaker was talking about his personal life, and he brought up the term displacement. And it just hit me in the right way, because I was like, there was like a missed opportunity to seize at the event on how displacement and Judaism are not like, they're not kind of cousins. It's like for the last 2,000 years, that's kind of been a hallmark trait. Like the multi-millennia interregnum between the sacking of the Second Temple and the establishment of the State of Israel, like Judaism was about displacement. There was a lot of missed opportunity, not just at the event, but I realized for me, because I'm like, I grew up and I thought I knew a lot about Judaism. I know Judaism. I was like in my 30s at the time, right? Judaism, right? Okay, I know Judaism. And then it turns out I really know very, very little about Judaism if I didn't know about the refugeeism of our cultural identity. If I didn't understand that within the, 4,000, 5,000 years of historical consciousness that is Judaism, how much of it is about displacement. Because, you and I, we sound like we're around the same age. Like we've grown up in a time, in an era where that just hasn't been the case for Judaism, right? Like we're somewhat secure and safe in the United States, and there's a place called Israel. But like you go back 100 years, you go back 1,000 years, that's just not what Judaism didn't have that sense of safety. We didn't have that sense of security in terms of a sovereignty that accepted us and that had laws and legislation and legislators that would protect us. So this displacement was always at the back of my mind over the last 10 years. And then, as I said, 3 years ago, it really, really started to hit me.
We talk more about how Sam's Jewish values work in the podcast, but first, a message from our sponsor. This podcast is sponsored by Downtown Dogs Daycare and Boarding, where furry family members play and stay by the hour, day, week, or longer. And Dogs Day Out, featuring 7 socially distanced dog bathtubs and the Zen Den for Shire pups. Located near the Minneapolis Farmers Market and offering curbside fetch and retrieve upon request. All breeds, sizes, and ages are welcome. Visit us at dtdogs.com and dogsdaympls.com. It's interesting, and it's funny in a way that you segued into this area, because my next question was going to be how does your Judaism and your Jewish values and your Jewish practice intersect with the podcast and with the work that you do, not only with that, but the work you had done previously.
Yeah, so I had done a lot of theater practicing, I guess I'll call it, where I had been writing plays and I had been writing scripts where Judaism was, if it wasn't at the heart of the play, it certainly was like an arm and a leg. And, that Jewish values and Judaism was part of the material. I guess I'd won the prestigious award, National Jewish Playwriting Award for one of the a script I had written years ago about the return of Elijah the prophet. But I'd always had Judaism as sort of a feature. But when I launched the podcast, and you'll hear in the podcast, hopefully people out there will hear in the podcast, I don't bring it front and center all the time. And I guess a lot of that is because there's so many people in the United States. And when you travel around the country, right, you realize, oh God, like Jews really are less than 2% of the population. I mean, there's so many different folks out there that I don't want to force Judaism onto a listener. I don't want the podcast and myself to be like, hey, this is a Jew talking to you, right? And it's obvious I'm Jewish on the podcast. I mean, there's episodes where it's my rabbi, and a rabbi is a big voice. And there's things I think I even mention, sometimes that I'm Jewish. But there's a lot of people out there who I want to bring in to the circle of recognition, of empathy, of understanding without it being like a lecture. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't want to lecture to people or be didactic or sound like I'm making pronouncements, right? That's not good storytelling. And so I just let it sit there. And I think that's probably true to answer your question, how a lot of Jews function in their daily life, right? Like if you're not walking around with a black hat or a yarmulke on, right, there are ways to sort of be present with your Jewish values and lead in a society with Jewish values without having to say, by the way, I'm leading with my Jewish values right now, right? You can be or at least I feel this way, that I could be a good Jew and I can be an emblem of the Star of David without having to walk around holding up a flag, because I live in a society that I live in a society that still honors plurality.
Right.
And as part of that plurality, I don't want to hold high the banner of Judaism whenever I speak or whenever I do something, because, there's still that age-old anti-Semitic trope of the dual loyalty.
Right.
And so I'm an American. I was born in the United States. I'm proud, as I say right up front in the podcast, I'm proud to be from the United States. Like, this is my country and this is my home. I love the United States. I also love being a Jew, and I love being a Jew in the United States, but I don't have to walk around like every time I say something going, by the way, I'm a Jew in the United States. And I think that,
Right. And that's the thing. It's, we as Jews, we're not monolithic, right? We don't all act the same way. We don't all think the same way. We don't all vote the same way. We, do live in that intersectionality between, our religion and our, the nationality of being Americans. And it can be, especially, not to get too political, over the last few years, it's been a tougher spot to live in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the multidimensionality of Judaism, particularly as an American Jew, I mean, the dimensions are kind of endless, right? And there's a lot of, I don't know if this is a great term to sort of mix in here, but there's a lot of crossover possibilities, right? Within being a Jew, an American Jew, because so many of us, if people came and it's like, hey, you know what? I don't know much about your Judaism, right? It's like, tell me, what does it mean to be an American Jew? Well, you could get 10 American Jews and they would get, the joke, 11 different answers, right?
Right.
It's like, there is no, great word you use. There is no monolithic answer. There's no standard answer. It's just a lot of, so then then I think about it, right? Just, of what does it mean to be American Jew if you are going to cast a wide band instead of a narrow band, right? On the nature and type of story that's being told around child detention, right? Or family separation, or mass deportation raids, or denial of asylum rights, right? Like we are witnessing an unprecedented and coordinated attack on immigrants seeking to enter our country and on migrant communities that already exist within our borders, right? So you think about Jews prior to and during the Holocaust trying to get out of Europe and coming to the United States, when the United States, for many who don't know, said no. And the U.S. closed its borders and closed its eyes and ears to the petitions of European Jews who knew that they were in trouble, right? They even went so far, I think there was like the Evian conference, right? Where like there was like an international consortium of Western world powers that basically subtly said, we're just going to deny the immigration of Jews, of European Jewry to come into our countries, right? So if you got those 10 American Jews together and said, all right, forget trying to describe or forget trying to talk about what it means to be a Jew in the United States. Let's talk about Jewish values or Jewish identity around the narrow band that I just described, those
Right.
issues, and understanding our history in it. Maybe you'd get one answer, maybe. And the answer would be, well, hell no, this can't happen. Like, we have to stand up. We have to do something. And so maybe this is a long 30-minute answer to your original question, but that's kind of where I came at American Refugee and why I, as a Jew, said, I have to do something. Even though every episode is a hell of a lot of work. And even though, I put myself at great personal risk sometimes to do this work, it's like, I think people need to hear the stories. And when I say people, I don't mean Jews. I mean my fellow Americans. I right. want my fellow 325 million Americans to hear the stories. And the stories are getting out there, and it feels good when you know that people are listening and responding.
No, for sure. And, the story of, in episode 2, and again, in the interest of full disclosure and journalistic integrity, I have not listened to all of it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it, but in the story of Angel, and, that you were able to talk to a woman, it gets some, very personal stories about her homelessness and her own displacement, and her, considering, herself as just a statistic. When you tried to categorize her as an American refugee, was almost haunting.
Yeah, it was haunting to me. And and that's an episode where I basically met this family through Temple Israel, through volunteering, through being a volunteer at Temple Israel. I met this family. And I couldn't believe what I learned, right? Like, a lot of the podcast is me as kind of like the wisecracking learner. Like, I'm learning along with the audience, because I really am learning along with the audience about what's happening in the United States. And it's a great word you used, haunting. And she tells some amazing stories. The thing that's interesting about, I guess, my role is that, yeah, and in some ways there's investigative journalism, but I still talk to Angel. Like, I care about the people I meet. Like, I'm still in touch with these people. It's not like, hi, I'm a member of the media. I'm just going to walk in here and get your story. Thanks a lot. Goodbye. I try not to do that. Because I care about some of these people. And like, when you hear Angel's story, or, you just are like, what? Did that really happen to you? And you can't help but care,
Right. And it's hard. And as a member of the media, I don't take I know you didn't mean it this way. I don't take it as, like, I think some people might take it as some sort of insult. Like, we parachute in and report the story, and then just whatever is left in our wake is left in our wake. But
right.
The unfortunate part is sometimes that's how it goes.
Right. And I don't mean
I don't like it.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't mean I have to like it. But a lot of times that's just, I still, believe in the, in the neutrality of, not making yourself part of the story.
Right. It's not,
you tell them, you interview, you gather facts, you tell the story.
right.
It's different. It's just different ways of telling the story.
Right. And I don't mean it as libel and slander towards the media. I'm just stating like one of the areas of podcasting that we have the benefit of doing is we're not traditional media that I don't, like you said, parachute in. It's like I'm there to get a story, but then it's like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. And so it's part of like, when you're enchanted by the tenacity and the beauty of the human spirit, it's really difficult to sever yourself or separate yourself from some of the subjects of those stories.
Yeah.
And so I guess as a Jew, right, I try to think like our Jewish values of, promoting the healing of the world is that we don't just abandon those that we've come across, and we try to, always forward in our work, helping them or making the world a better place so that they can be better.
Yeah. Well, I hope people listen. I hope people, whether they decide to act or be involved, if nothing else, it's really compelling storytelling.
Yeah. I mean,
and hopefully people listen and enjoy and take it for that.
Yeah. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to say, and it, like a podcast, great. A podcast is 30 to 45 minutes, but the real work, or like the work that you're doing, there's so much incredible work being done with like the JCRC and the JCA, right? And the synagogues. I mean, there's so much incredible work that's being done through Jewish organizations locally. And so much of my story access is through that. It's through the volunteer work. And I'm just really proud to be a Jew in Minneapolis because of the people that work so hard every day to not, and their work is not just to make Jews better, but to make the entire community better. I mean, the work that you're doing is fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
TC Jew Folk has been a banner of the Jewish community for years, right? This series that you're doing, it serves a real great purpose because it's bringing to a Jewish audience, the work that's being done locally by Jews and, with Jews, I would say, and through a Jewish lens. And it's important for people to hear that today. Because, as we get older, the monolith of our teen years where we all like watched or were programmed to the same channels, like we get older and we start needing different compasses to guide us. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
And to have sort of the Jewish values, even if you're not a religious Jew, right? Like, I guess I didn't answer your question about what kind of Jew am I, but even if
I don't necessarily care. I don't care what kind of Jew you are.
but even if you're not a religious Jew, if religion isn't even part of it, but you're like, well, I'm still Jewish. It's like, okay, well, where does that come from? Is it a pride in a value system? Is it pride of saying, well, we always do the right thing? And it's like, okay, well, what is the right thing? And
right, that goes down a whole different rabbit hole.
But it's like, well, we think we're trying to do the right thing, and we want to, when someone, says, well, why? It's like, well, who is that person, or why should we trust them? Why do they have honor and integrity? Judaism may not be the answer, but hopefully it's part of an answer.
Right. I mean, and that's sort of the thing. And I know, we both have kids roughly the same age. It's, it's, helping them sort of, helping them along and, helping them understand that it's not, Judaism is not just what goes on in synagogue on Friday night or Saturday morning. Sorry to my friendly rabbis who are listening to this, but it's, it's bigger than that. If you want it to be.
Right. I mean, my kids are like, Dad, why are you doing all this travel? Why are you working so hard on this one podcast? And I'm like, well, it's time to raise public awareness and to raise public consciousness of how, our American policies are negatively affecting people of displacement and those seeking refuge within the promise, of of a better America. And, if we as Jews believe in equal opportunity, right, we have to recognize that we might be living in a sovereignty or a system that, has fallen well short of that promise. And it's our job as Jews to kind of fight for the promise to be fulfilled, even if it's not directly positively affecting us, our actions, and helping others. We can't live in a society where ultimately those promises are going to end, and what's happened to the Jews for the last 2,000 years is going to circle back and hit us again. Right. So, I guess the podcast and my work is a reflection of who I am, right? Like, again, I think I'm funny, so I try to be funny and informative, but at the same time, the things can be heartbreaking and maddening, and the plurality of information delivery, right, and the plurality of those, I guess, kind of characteristics within storytelling. That's what makes great storytelling, is when everything is funny and heartbreaking and informative, but maddening, but also in the end satisfying, with a little bit of hope. So I'm just really grateful. I think if there's anything to describe the work that I've been doing, I'm just so grateful that I have the chance to do it, because wherever I go, I see things through the eyes of the storyteller. And I'm like, oh man, I cannot wait to tell this story. I can't wait to work really hard to craft, a 40-minute episode that's going to make people go, wow, because I go, wow, when I hear this stuff. I mean, I don't know how long this episode's supposed to be, but I'll just tell you, I was on travel with a mask. Actually, I had 12 masks on the entire time I was traveling, so I don't want anybody out there thinking Sam's the bad guy. But I was essentially on travel with the kids for MEA break, and we were at a ranch where I just learned about endurance horse riding, and there was a woman who was a recent emigre from South Africa. She had left South Africa because of corruption and crime, and had been looking for a place where she could essentially continue her work as a horse rancher and a horse rider. I didn't even know we had like endurance horse racing in the United States. Maybe everybody else out there did. Maybe everyone's like,
I have never heard of that at all.
It's like a big race. It's kind of like Telluride, but for horse racing, and it happens every year. Well, I'm like, okay, let's go get this story. Let's talk about her as a sojourner, as somebody who's displaced, but who really loves horses and still has to be involved. So I'm like, as I'm like talking to her, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I can't wait to tell this story. And so that's an example of how grateful I am that I'm at a part in my life where I can share my enthusiasm for storytelling with a national listening audience.
Well, that sounds like a great story. Do you always have your recording gear with you just in case?
Okay. Like, do I even have it under my pillow at night, like I learned. So it's cool, right? Like, cause the difference with video, right? Everybody's like video. The society is so video centric this year because we're all at home, right? So, YouTube watchership exploded. The TikTok-y, Instagram-y viewership exploded, right? But the cool thing about audio is I don't need all that gear. I don't need lights, and I don't need camera angles, and I don't need, makeup. I just need a microphone that I can hold up to someone's mouth, or a microphone that I can just have in the general area. So yes, I have my gear with me always. And I'm like, I never know when that next incredible moment is going to happen. And I've gotten adept at deploying the gear and brandishing it rapidly without it interfering with that moment. So
that's the key.
So I do carry it everywhere, but I try to be responsible with it always. Like I'm never trying to slyly or like, this isn't gotcha journalism. This isn't aha surprise journalism. Like, I always tell people right up front who I am and what I'm doing. So it's like, especially if they don't know who I am, and it's like, why are you holding this weird taser looking thing in your hand all of a sudden? Right. So I do carry my gear with me everywhere. And I do try to capture, but at the same time, the storytelling that I do is not so precise or so laser focused that it's like, oh, here's just this moment. Usually things are much, much bigger. And some of the episodes have taken me a year to make. Like the current episode about domestic violence took me a full year from when I started and first recording to when the episode actually got distributed.
Wow.
Or when I dropped the episode was 1 year.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
See, and that's the thing I think a lot of people don't know, because the medium it's not that new, but it's still new enough that it's not, people think, oh, okay, it's a 40-minute episode. It took you 40 minutes, you record for 40 minutes, or maybe you have a little extra that you cut out. But I mean, to create that, it's obvious, like this particular episode you're talking about is a year of work and, probably countless hours of audio that never sees the light of day.
Right. Like, I don't know how God created the earth in 7 days, because like some of these episodes take me a year to make. I'm like,
right.
Oh my God, that's, it's just like a long slog for, because you have to wait for the right moments to come along where you're like, okay, this is going to work, or I need this particular segment to make the story shine. Which is different than other podcasts that I produce. So I mentioned to you that I'm the producer for other podcasts,
right?
And many of them are talk. I mean, they are, weekly deadlines. We're dropping episodes every week, but they're talk and they're interview focused. And even though some of them, one in particular has, kind of the biggest names in Democratic Party leadership as the weekly guests, the host still has to put together what I call an opening monologue. He's writing 2,000 to 3,000 words a week. I'm like, it is a lot of work to put out quality audio that keeps people coming back. And while I'm grateful, right, for the opportunity to do it, so, you have to wake up every day and go, remember that you're grateful, because it is so, it's just, it's just a lot of work. And, sometimes, you how like, I'm not a gamer, but many people are gamers, and you can stare at a screen for 6 hours. And when you close your eyes at night, you still see the screen in front of your face.
Yep.
Well, I see the little audio engineering wavy lines every night, because I could be in front of my screen for 10 hours a day, just staring at the software interface. And whether it's, American Refugee or the other podcasts that I produce, there's just a lot of staring at interface and making the audio sound good. So it's more than just carrying, hardware gear on me. It's always being up to date on the latest software and the tips and tricks and how to make things sound good. And that's where the balance of the gratitude and the gratefulness of being able to tell the story comes, like with you have to craft enjoyment out of each experience and enjoyment out of your daily work. Otherwise, it becomes a slog.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Sam Graber, thank you so much for joining us. Last couple questions, and we will let you get back to the wavy lines and the audio interface. What is your favorite Jewish food?
Wow. Okay. So my wife makes this, I don't even have a name for it, but she makes it on Jewish holidays. It's this like matzah mixed with chocolate, honey. It's like the most divine ambrosia-like dessert you've ever, like, I can't imagine like manna beating out what my wife makes. So there's not like a name for it. It's just her special dessert.
Okay. That sounds tasty.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a name for, like, you think for how good it is we would have come up with a name for it, like we would have titled it, there would be some like appellation that we would have donned or connoted on that. No, I don't have it. It's just, can you make that dessert thing again? That's what we kind of say.
Well, at least she knows what you're talking about.
Right.
And what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, wow. I used to have a singular holiday. Like I used to be able to say Purim, or I used to be able to say, Hanukkah. But the older I get, the more I just really appreciate Shabbat. Because you think, well, it's once a week. Doesn't that get old? Like every week? But every week I start to reflect on how little I know and how how awesome the opportunity is to continually reconnect and reflect with family and the people that are close to you, and how good it is to be a Jew. So I do appreciate Shabbat as a, I mean, I don't know if it's a holiday, but I consider it a holiday. It's like once a week. And I don't keep kosher, and I'm not observant. I'm not an observant Jew, but
Okay.
the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, Shabbat. That's a good holiday. I like that one. Keep that thing happening.
No, it is definitely, I definitely would consider it. It is a fairly popular selection to this question, but definitely, and I think for some of the similar reasons too, but I definitely would consider it that.
Yeah.
Well, Sam Graber, thank you so much for joining us. American Refugee is the podcast. We'll have the link in the show notes. It is available, I assume, anywhere you're listening to this podcast. You can find American Refugee as well, I assume. Correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Sam, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to upcoming episodes of the show.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, and thanks everyone out there for listening. I really appreciate it.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast. Thanks again to our sponsor this week, Downtown Dogs, the Twin Cities' largest doggy daycare and boarding facility.